Good evening. This evening I'm going to be reading from Lectures on Jung's Aion by Barbara Hannah, Marie-Louise von Franz, and interviewed by Claude Drey. And tonight I'm going to read a portion of Conversations on Aion between Marie-Louise von Franz and Claude Drey regarding Chapter 14, the structure and dynamics of the self. Chapter 14 of Aion researches into the phenomenology of the self, the structure and dynamics of the self, opens with the following sentence, quote, "The examples given in the previous chapter should be sufficient to describe the progressive assimilation and amplification of the archetype that underlies ego consciousness." Paragraph 347. Drey. By progressive assimilation, does Jung refer to what he said earlier at the end of Chapter 12 of Aion? Quote, "In conclusion, I would like to emphasize once again that the fish symbol is a spontaneous assimilation of the Christ figure of the Gospels, and is thus a symptom which shows us in what manner and with what meaning the symbol was assimilated by the unconscious. In this respect, the patristic allegory of the capture of Leviathan, with the cross as the hook and the crucified as the bait, is highly characteristic. A content, fish, of the unconscious, sea, has been caught and has attached itself to the Christ figure. Hence the expression used by St. Augustine, de profundo levatus, drawn from the deep. This is true enough of the fish, but of Christ? The image of the fish came out of the depths of the unconscious as an equivalent of the historical Christ figure, and if Christ was involved as ichthys, this name referred to what had come up out of the depths. The fish symbol is thus the bridge between the historical Christ and the psychic nature of man, where the archetype of the Redeemer dwells. In this way, Christ became an inner experience, the Christ within. Paragraph 285. Now, these paragraph numbers are referring to paragraph numbers within Aion, and keeping in mind that we have, in our advanced reading group, we have completed a complete seminar on Aion. It's in the advanced reading group Dropbox already, and I'm just for general information making this conversation about it available to the general public. Good evening, Buzz. Nice to see you. Dave Clark, nice to see you. Thank you for your encouragement. I really appreciate it, especially since I got hammered by someone on another video who claimed that I'm a terrible reader and I better get better. Grenade says, Aion is trippy. I can't get past much without having to constantly reread sections of it. Well, I'm going to share something with you. In fact, I can do that now because one of the issues is the structure of the psyche, and this image, which was created by Edward Edinger in his book, The Aion Lectures, is an image to explain the structure of the psyche. It's in the Dropbox in various places. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. Anyway, so in answer to Drey's question now, von Franz, yes, You see, there are two processes, and keeping in mind that what we're talking about throughout Dr. Jung's work is psychic processes. So this is all about processes, including all the religious work. Thanks, Buzz. I try to be personable. Okay, here we go. So there are two processes. Suppose, for example, you want to interpret an archetypal dream. You would amplify. Your patient has a dream about a goat, and you consult many books to learn what you can about a goat. This is what we call amplifying. Now, the other process is that the archetype does the same thing himself. He amplifies himself. This we call assimilation of the archetype. For instance, there is the archetype of the fish in the sea of the unconscious. At the same time, on the surface of the earth, a man called Jesus goes around preaching. The fish says, "This is me." The fish thereby assimilates the figure of Christ. An archetype can amplify itself by assimilating material. So this archetype is in the unconscious, and it has consciousness of its own. So Drey says, it manifests itself in a man as an assimilation by putting the two together. But what you are saying is that before these two could come together, Franz, the archetype, has said, "Aha, that man Jesus is me. I am going to swallow him." And then men on the surface of the earth begin to say that Christ is the fish. They are influenced by the archetype. Drey, is this an archetypal process? Do the archetypes do that? Franz, yes. They relate to each other. They eat or assimilate each other. Drey, independently of consciousness? Franz, within the unconscious. In the unconscious beyond consciousness. This happens in dreams of religious, primitive representations. Someone has a dream about a snake that eats a bird. Here the dreamer has not done anything. The snake, which represents the archetype of the serpent, has assimilated the archetype of the spirit by eating the bird. This has happened entirely in the unconscious. If a patient has such a dream, you cannot give him an interpretation that rings a bell for him because the dream content is too far removed from his consciousness. Yet one archetype has assimilated the other. 10 years later, it might dawn upon him in his consciousness, and then he can relate the dream to something. Drey, by the assimilation of the archetype, therefore, you mean, Franz, to bring together, to swallow up, to pull up closer, or even to take in. Drey, in other words, the archetypes have a private life of their own, and they manipulate man. Franz, yes, they have a private life of their own. Man always stumbles afterwards. For example, we know now from the mythology and from the dreams of modern man that God wants not only to incarnate in his light side, which is Christ, but to incarnate in his dark side also. He wants to become one again. We know this, but 80% of mankind do not yet know it. However, their dreams say so, which means the archetype has done it first. It is our task to make the meaning of this real. Drey, that is an interesting investigation. Franz, I know a very personable Christian school teacher who dreamt the other day that the dark brother of God, the eternal snake in the pit of hell, wants to incarnate now. Mind you, this is just a modern man who has not read Jung, but he is told that the dark side of God wants to incarnate in him. He hasn't the foggiest idea in his consciousness just what that means for him. I see that in about 10 years, he will make some discoveries. Drey. So the examples given in the previous chapter should be sufficient to describe the progressive assimilation and amplification of the archetype that underlies ego consciousness. Paragraph 347. Von Franz. Yes, that is the archetype of the self. Drey. Now, in the examples Jung gave in the previous chapter, was it his intention to show how the archetype actually works? In this book, how does he say it actually works? Von Franz. In this book, for instance, he tells you there has been an old archetypal projection into the sky of the two fishes. One fish has assimilated Jesus. He has eaten up the Jesus archetype, and Jesus has become the fish. One might infer that, logically, the second half of Christianity is the other fish, which is the devil, or the dark side of God. Now you can prove from the writings of Nostradamus that people noticed that now the dark side of God wanted to incarnate. And then came the alchemists who made a counter-Christ, a material counter-Christ called the lapis, and they called him, too, the fish. Okay, now keep in mind that we're talking about the astrological age of Pisces, which we're just passing out of. And Bernard says, is syzygy Latin? What does that mean? Okay, the syzygy means to be yoked together. And so you could think of it as yin-yang, the yin-yang symbol. For example, that would be a syzygy, where it's a pair of opposites that are stuck with one another. They don't have any choice. They're just stuck. And I'm just checking to see if I have an example here. I don't have it right teed up, but maybe I can go back to it later. But anyway, there are many syzygies. Every pair of opposites is a syzygy. And the most common one is the masculine-feminine syzygy, or the anima-animus syzygy, and you can't get away from them. And a marriage is making a whole being, because we all come to a marriage with dominant traits, dominant personality type traits, such as sensing and intuition, extroversion, introversion. Those are traits. And so if you are the opposite of your wife, then your wife is going to bring things out. So I happen to be introverted, and it helps me, even though my wife is introverted, she's a little bit closer to the extroverted scale than I am, and so therefore I get to go to parties sometimes thanks to her. Whereas if it was only up to me, I'd probably stay home and make videos about Jung. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing that a syzygy will do for you. But it can also be very negative, obviously. Buzz says, do you think that the fish was more the people who were caught, as Christ's disciples were fishers of men? Well, certainly it wasn't that the people, let's see. It wasn't that the people were caught so much as the archetype within the psyche of the people was caught. And so when you're fishing around in the psyche, and that brings up our standard caveat about Jungian psychology, which is you can find in your unconscious things that are big fish. They're too big to deal with. And Edinger wrote an entire book about Moby Dick, explaining it from an archetypal Jungian point of view. You can find that in the Dropbox. Grenade says, syzygy refers to the union of opposites in this context, or in astronomy it refers to a collinear configuration of 3 celestial bodies. Okay, well, the astronomers have added something. Typically, what we're looking at in Jungian psychology is a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. So, before you're married, you're a thesis. You think you're a complete person, but then when you get married, you realize that your wife may be the antithesis of you in some ways, and that's good. I'll explain how. And then when the two of you have been living together for some time, then there's a synthesis between the two of you in several ways. One of them might be a child, but one of them is a rebus, which Billy Joel referred to in one of his songs as you're the only one who knows. And so things that you share with your spouse, sometimes they're just impossible to share with someone else. You had to be there to appreciate it. And so on the Myers-Briggs scales, the 4 scales there, in your marriage, you want 2 or 3 of the scales to be the same. If 4 are different, if all 4 are different, you're on the opposite side on all 4, then you're going to have too much conflict. And if they're all the same, it's going to be a very boring life. So the point is that by having 2 or 3 of them the same, or 2 or 3 different, it gets you moving. It creates psychic energy between the two of you. And Dave Clark says, you should check out Andrew Samuel's Critical Dictionary of Jung. It's an excellent book. Yeah. It's actually this book. and this is by Samuels and by Banny Shorter and Fred Plout. And I have used it a few times. I've read some of the definitions in, so that's a good book. Thanks, Dave, for reminding me. Okay, so let me see. So von Franz says, okay, so Drey says, what is the material lapis? And von Franz says, the material lapis is the other fish. Jung shows that in 1200 AD, it dawned on the alchemists that the Christ fish and the lapis fish are 2 aspects of the same thing. All this proves is that there's an enormous age-old process going on over thousands of years, which works and goes on by itself according to its own law. However, the process influences our consciousness, and therefore it is important for us to know. For instance, it is important for modern man to know that we are now in the age of the second fish. Otherwise, he is not in tune. Drey, with his time. Von Franz, with the processes of the archetype underneath. Otherwise, he is a kind of anachronism and belongs to the Middle Ages. There are such people today, and they get into endless trouble. The other day, a clergyman came to see me. He was really an early-age Christian. I did not know what to do because I cannot modernize him artificially. On the other hand, in his parish and everywhere he gets into all sorts of trouble. I finally talked him into retiring to a remote rural district because people there are still lagging behind the times. There, he is still modern. In a city, however, he cannot function because he is a medieval man and gets into constant trouble. So I thought that if he went to a small remote farming village where people are still medieval, he would be in his right milieu. But he would still be out of time with the present times, and that's how he is. He is an old man, and you cannot change him. So it is all for the best. He is going to a backward area where he will not feel, Drey, where the majority of people are like him, von Franz, are like him, and he will not notice the anachronism so badly. But if he remained in a city clergyman, he would be constantly bucking himself and lagging behind the times. Now, if he were a young man, I would wake him up and say, look at the big world clock. We are in the second fish. You cannot be a medieval man anymore. But he is too old for that. Drey. Jung then writes, quote, rather than add to their number unnecessarily, I will try to summarize them as an overall picture results. Paragraph 347. Now, if you wanted to trace the assimilation and the development of the idea of the self, what would be the various historical stages? Roughly speaking, how would you classify the stages of the self? It seems to me that in the previous chapters, these various stages have been discussed. If I wanted to give someone a synopsis of the previous chapters, how would I do that? Looking at the table of contents, the order is as follows. Christ, a symbol of the self. Then, the sign of the fishes. Then, the prophecies of Nostradamus. Then, the historical significance of the fish. Then, the fish in alchemy. It is always the fish. He picks on the fish as one of the archetypes. And von Franz says, who changes throughout history? This book is about what underlies the Christ figure, the fish, and the process it has gone through. You see, in official dogma, the Christ fish is more or less the same thing, a marvelous man who, with locks and a white nightgown, who preaches that we should behave ourselves. Underneath, however, there's a tremendous process that has been brought that figure to light and which goes on evolving. So the first question is, what is behind Christ? There you come to the archetype of the fish, but the archetype of the fish does not remain constant over thousands of years. It slowly changes. It is not only an image, but a process. Drey. Yes. And what are the various stages? Von Franz. First you have the myth of the God-man, who is more a god than a man, and who is only one God-man. For instance, there was the myth of Gilgamesh, which was still in the ram age, before that of the fish. Already at that time you find images of the God-man. Then at the birth of Christ, the God-man becomes a real man, true God and true man. This is the new dogma. God is a historical man. Before you have the God-man Osiris and other God-men, but they are not historical figures. They are mythological figures. As to this fellow who lived in Nazareth, on such and such a street, they said he was God-man. At that moment, Christ was assimilated to the fish, and this coincided with the astrological age of the fish. This means that the archetype of the fish, which is the archetype of the Savior, is the saving thing which comes from the unconscious. Drey. How come the fish is associated with the saving thing? Von Franz. Because it feeds you, it leads you. Jung brings lots of amplifications. The fish saves the Vedas, brings the light, teaches wisdom. Oannes is the fish god. As something unexpected comes from the depths, it has always been projected onto the fish. And Dr. Edinger commented that if you start to pull up a fish that's too big for your boat, as Captain Ahab did in Moby Dick, then you better cut the line and let that fish away for a while. And what he meant was that you have to develop your ego, in order to be able to handle the fish that you find in the unconscious. And if you pull up a fish that your ego can't cope with yet, you better cut the line and let it go back until you have a stronger ego. Drey, something which is alive and meaningful to man. A fish is meaningful to man. Franz, it is mainly a teacher of the meaningful new message. So along came a man named Jesus who lived somewhere and pretended to be the Son of God. Ordinarily, this would have had no effect. He would have been one fool out of many fools. For a lot of people at the time of Christ said they were the Son of Man, bringing the truth. But with Christ, there was an immediate association. People said, "He is the fish." This means he is the thing from the depth that can tell us the real truth. People must have had the feeling that this fellow was more real and had something behind him, and behind him was the fish. Drey, the archetype, so to say, had already made the arrangement. Franz, yes, the archetype had made the arrangement. It had picked on him, and that is why he was so sure in feeling. And that is why he is so sure of feeling I am it. He felt that the archetype had picked him, and that he was in accordance with the archetype. And the archetype had picked him, but an archetype does not stay put. It evolved into a more and more supporting movement toward spiritualization, ethics, and light. You know, good behavior, repression, and so on. Drey, how did the fish do that? Franz, well, the fish is a double fish in astrology. Drey, I mean the first fish, how did he do that? Franz, well, you have those similes from the early Christians. We are little fish of Christ. We are the thing which is fished from the depth. Christ is the fish which nourishes us at the end of the day. The fish was always interpreted positively. It became a symbol for the new truth according to which they would behave well. For instance, there should be no sexual desires outside of marriage. People felt that, if they followed this, they were fulfilling the archetype's intention. Drey, the fish's intention? Franz, yes, they felt this was the fish's intention. This was his message, his new message. Drey, and did people really speak of the fish as being an image prior to Christ? Franz, no, they did not speak of it in so many words, but they always said, Christ is the fish, and the fish is Christ. Drey, what did they mean by that? Franz, they did not know what they meant. It took Jung to find out what they meant. They just spoke about it. Drey, it came to them? Franz, it came to them to say so. It came to them to say so, as it is with religious truths. You speak them because you are convinced, yet you cannot quote chapter or verse. If you question such people, they simply say it is so. That is why they call it a revelation, something that suddenly stands before your eyes, but you cannot say why. And Jung discovered why. He discovered that this symbolized a phase in the development of the self. Drey, the self behind the fish and behind Christ. Franz, that means that the self is an enormous wheel which rolls through the ages. It develops and has phases, good phases, bad phases, dark phases. Jung tries to show all the phases, but he covers two of them only, namely the first fish and the second fish, because our historical knowledge covers only about that period. It is just a tiny fraction of that enormous archetypal wheel which goes on through the ages. Once Jung said, I can intuit what the Waterman age will look like, but as for the Capricorn age, I haven't even a wild fantasy. We can't overlook the next phase, for we are approaching the waterman age. We have a vague hunch what it might be like. Thus, these phases go on over thousands of years, and Jung took just one, the one we know relatively well, and by it he tried to prove that through the ages, the self is a long, long process of development. Drey, the archetype that underlies ego consciousness, does this mean that underlying ego consciousness there is a moving, developing archetype? Von Franz, exactly. Drey, which lives a life of its own? Von Franz, exactly. It lives a life of its own and rolls on through the ages, changing. Drey, and our ego consciousness can only be a small, Von Franz, the smallest sector of it. Drey, now Jung says, rather than add to their number unnecessarily, I will try to summarize them so that an overall picture results. Paragraph 347. Now here I get the impression that he begins quoting certain authors who speak of the manifestation of this totality. Jung quotes them in the following sequence. First Hippolytus, then Clement of Alexandria, then Monoimus, and then he gives an example from the Kina Upanishad, and then he gives an example from Yajnavalkya. Now with this sequence and with these examples, does he mean to prove the ubiquity and autothonism of the self, or is he alluding again to the development you just mentioned? Von Franz, no, he is showing the ubiquity and showing that other people have also gotten a hunch of this great age-old process exists. For instance, I recall Monoimus, who says, realize for a minute what thinks in you, what sleeps in you, what yawns involuntarily, what suddenly has a thought. Then he says, this is a little doctor, and this doctor is God. So it means I always have the illusion that I think and so on, but I don't do all this. You don't go to sleep. You can't go if it does not want you, if it does not want. You have to take a pill if God does not want to sleep. So there is an enormous involuntary life process in you, which you are the expression of. You open your mouth, you yawn and say, oh, I've got an idea. You have not made all this. It lives in you. It is a very simple thing. Monoimus realized this. There is a life in us which moves our hands, makes us yawn, and makes us think. That thing is a unit, and that unit is God. Drey, and that unit undergoes a process. This is important. You see, I understand there exists something within me which was independent of me, but now we add the idea that this thing, which exists independently, also undergoes an historical change. Von Franz, exactly. A very slow historical change. You can put it very simply. It boils down to the realization that God is developing. Drey, is this a hypothesis? Von Franz, it is a speculation. You can say that from the things you see, it looks like that. You cannot say it is so. You can only say that it looks as if. Drey, the idea that God is developing gives a lot of meaning to oneself. Von Franz, for instance, it is the same thing with the theory of evolution. You cannot prove absolutely that we have developed from one cell algae, but from all the evidence it looks very much like that. Fossils and our way of developing in the mother's womb give us hunches which seem to say that we have developed from one celled algae through millions of ages. Thus, we can say that from all psychological documents, it looks as if God, passing through us over millions of years, is developing toward new forms of consciousness. Drey. Behind everything that goes on is God, who is always evolving. Franz. He is not standing still. He is changing and evolving. Drey. Like a great experimenter. Franz. It implies an evolving creation and an evolving God image. Quote, in Menoemus, who is called the Arab, Indian influences are not impossible. His statement is significant because it shows that even in the 2nd century, the ego was considered the exponent of an all-embracing totality, the self, a thought that by no means all psychologists are familiar with even today. Paragraph 350. Drey. His statement is significant because it shows that even in the 2nd century, the ego was considered the exponent of an all-embracing totality, the self. Jung does not mention process. Franz. No, there he does not. No, there he does not. He merely refers to documents which show that people at that time understood that the background of what they felt is something different. The idea of the evolving God image came only with alchemy. The alchemists saw that it was evolving. The others had not realized that. Drey. I see. The idea of historical evolving came with alchemy. Franz. The alchemists realized that it was evolving, that it was changing. Others only realize that there is something behind our ego which is divine. The alchemists realize that too. But added it undergoes a process. They also had the genius to say that not only is it evolving, but we have to support it. We should not merely notice that it is evolving, but should try to support it. Drey. To be in tune with it. Franz. To be in tune and to support its evolution. Okay, I'll stop there and just take a look at what other comments may be here. Dave Clark says, yeah, the contrasexuals. He's back talking about the syzygy, the king and the queen in alchemy. Buzz Magister says, got to go to bed. Sorry for leaving so soon. I will be watching this later. Best wishes. Thanks, Buzz. And Grenade says, in chess too. And Dave says, that's the jobby. Grenade says, you just answered my question before I even asked it about the fish too big for the boat. You can read minds. Well, I don't know if that's true, but Grenade says, just kidding, but it was a wild coincidence. And Dave says, synchronicity for you. I'm from England, and I've got to turn into bed. Thank you for the edification. Okay, so that's as much of that interview as I'm going to read today. I'll consider whether to read more of it at a later time. But thank you for joining me today. I'm going to go to my dinner. We have people from all over the world, many from Australia and New Zealand. And so the result is that it's the middle of the night for them. I don't blame them. I keep trying to find times that suit most people. I intended to go on at 1:30 this afternoon, but I just didn't get to it. And that usually helps people all the way from Hawaii to Western Europe. But unfortunately, I didn't get to it today. So we'll see what happens in the future. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again soon.